Hello, everyone. This is David Aguilar, and today I want to talk about a few things. One is the analysis of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and this is really in preparation for the literary analysis assignment that you're going to be doing on one of the short stories that we're covering for this first unit. Of course, this means that you won't be able to do your analysis on the lottery because that's what we'll be doing in this lecture. But you will have an opportunity to do your analysis on one of the three remaining short stories for this unit. But before I go into that, I really did want to talk about one other thing, and that's discussion board. Now, I'm recording this this afternoon on Sunday, the 10th, and I just finished grading the discussion board assignments earlier this morning. So what I want to talk about is really just the grading system that I've used, because I've already had a few students email me asking about their grades and what they could do to improve and so on. Of course, I'm always happy to explain those kinds of things. But rather than having to respond to every single student and telling them exactly what they need to improve, I'm really just going to take it on a case-by-case basis. But I can say a few things. So what I have here is a breakdown, and I don't know if you can how well you can see this on the screen. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. But this is a grade breakdown for the week 2 discussion. And you'll see that there's 76 people, 76 students in Blackboard. The maximum anyone could have gotten was 100, and the minimum anyone could have gotten is 0. Now you'll notice that the average for this class was a 60. Now that average is thrown off for several reasons because of people who just didn't submit the assignment at all, and I don't think that's a fair representation of the actual grade. So I like to pay more attention to this median number. That one's probably more indicative of the actual average of the class. And even then, I would say it's a little bit higher than 70. But I would like to say that I was not as pleased with this first round discussion. And that's okay. That was to be expected. It's the first discussion board assignment of the semester, or at least for literature, because I know we did do one the first week, but that was just more of an introduction and not really what we need to expect throughout the semester. But I understand this was the first one for most people, and this was probably a difficult one. So the first thing I want to say is the people who received zeros are those who did not submit at all. Either, when I look on discussion board, they just did not post anything. It could have also been students who posted late, and of course, as I discussed in the syllabus, I do not accept late work unless there's a valid reason, and even then I'll take those on a case-by-case basis. I had one student for sure email me with documentation about why they couldn't submit, and that's okay, and we worked that out. But these other zeros are all people who just did not submit at all or did not submit on time. I also have a few random, like I think there was 125, there was a 40 at one point, and these were students who did less than considerable work. Some students just posted their first response to the main questions and didn't reply at all to anyone else. And then, others, posted late, their first one posted late, and so all I could grade technically were the responses or the replies to other students that were posted on time. But those, of course, don't count as much as the first post. The first post counts more heavily towards the discussion board grade, because that tells me everything about your contribution to reading and to the material itself. Some others, I had a lot of 50s. Again, these are people who submitted on time, but whose replies were not enough. These are people who more than likely submitted their first response on time, and it was decent. It was passable. It was okay. It was basically the bare minimum of what I would expect. But then the replies were full of summaries of other people's responses. They agreed essentially and just liked what other people had to say. And I had a lot of those in this discussion board. A lot of people saying, "Oh, I agree with your point, and I think that's very interesting, and I really like what you had to say. You did a great job." These are not discussion posts. These are more like, if you could put a like on Facebook, or if you could do a retweet on Twitter, that's essentially what that person's doing, and that's not really contributing to the discussion. That's not contributing to the discourse. That's essentially just giving praise to someone else's work, and you're not doing any work yourself. So I do want to say, though, that the majority of the class, at least half the class, fell into at least the A, B, or C range, and it had a few D's as well. So generally, I think most of you understood what I'm looking for, and I want to praise a few students, and if you received 100, you know who you are. And unfortunately, I wish I could reveal that right now, but I think for the moment I won't. But I do want to praise those students who, I think I only had 3 students get 100 on the assignment. Those students went above and beyond what I had expected. Essentially, these students not only replied to the first questions that I had with clear and well-developed answers, but they also used textual evidence to support their answers, and then whenever they did quote from the text, they cited correctly. And then when they responded to other students, they made sure to, of course they could have agreed with other people and liked what they had to say, but they didn't stop there. They continued and tried asking questions, bringing up more interesting points that weren't mentioned, looking at these different connections, not just within the text itself, but also to their own lives and to their own experience. So again, it should not end just where the question ends. If I asked you, what is juxtaposition, or what are some examples of juxtaposition in the story, it shouldn't just end there. We should think, well, why is this such an important idea? Why do we need to look for juxtaposition? What does the juxtaposition tell us about the story and its message? How do these devices contribute to the overall theme? And some of you attempted to do this or did something like this, and those are really the B's and C's right here. These are students who did that, who understood more or less what I was asking for, but just fell short. And again, you will have the rest of the semester to improve on the discussion board grade, but I don't want you to take this lightly. And I realize that the grades may have been a little bit harsh or maybe perhaps unexpected, but I do want to set this tone and the precedent for what I'm looking for in discussion. Because this is an online class, not a face-to-face class, this is the only discussion we're really going to have with each other, short of, let's say, I might have Blackboard Collaborate. This is where we can have an online space where we can chat with each other in the same classroom, virtual classroom. But until I can figure out a date when that would be most appropriate for everybody, for now, discussion board is going to be that space for us. So treat discussion board the same way you would treat a normal face-to-face class if you could talk to all these people. And there are, again, 76 people in this discussion. And so feel free, again, to probe and prod at a specific point or idea. The more specific you are, the better. And that's really what's going to improve the grade next time. Okay. That's all I wanted to say in terms of discussion board. I will address some of these questions, the actual questions themselves, later when I go into the analysis of the lottery. So let me do that now. So these are my notes for the short story. And I really wanted to break this down into several sections, and I'm going to go through these each one by one through some detail. So you'll notice that these are numbered, and this is the way I take notes. I prefer to take notes on analysis, or whenever I do an analysis of any piece of literature, I prefer to do it in this manner. So I always look at plots, I look at characters, point of view, setting, style, symbolism, and theme. And I always do theme last. The others, that can vary. I like to have it in this order just because I think of it as, really basic elements of a story to the really complex and implicit elements. So let's begin with plot. And I want to talk about plot first because we just went over it in the last lecture. We talked about Freytag's pyramid. This whole idea of there being like a sort of pyramid with a flat line, a rising action, a climax at the top, a falling action, and a denouement, right? Well, you'll find that Shirley Jackson's The Lottery is very much a traditional story in the sense that it follows this structure almost to a T. You'll notice that it begins with an exposition. It tells you, the date, June 27th, the morning of June 27th on a summer day. It mentions the town square, the villagers. It introduces all of these people, and it tells you that something is going to start. That the lottery is going to start. That it's going to take less than it used to take less than 2 hours, or it's going to take, it used to take this much time, but it's going to take less than 2 hours now, because the village is small. So it gives us all this information, and as some of you pointed out in discussion board, this is really innocuous, or it's not that very. There's no tension yet, right? And it's hard. I know some people had argued too that, well, this is where tension is relieved, right? But that's not true. There is no tension yet. Therefore, it cannot be relieved because it doesn't exist yet. We can only relieve tension once tension is there. And so tension does build here in the rising action. This is where all the conflict becomes obvious, right? The conflict is introduced right here in the exposition, especially towards the end of the exposition, but the conflict is building here. So this is where we have the villagers talking to each other. They're preparing for the lottery, and they select characters start exhibiting frustration and anxiety. We have, for example, some men gathering, and rather than laughing at jokes, they just smile. So they're sort of inhibiting their own desires to be happy and content. We have people making jokes and cracks at each other. About Mrs. Hutchinson Tessie. Obviously, she jokes about, not wanting to leave the dishes done, and she forgot what time it was, and she realized she needed to be somewhere, so she hurried as fast as she could. Right? This is all building tension because we know everyone's nervous. People are flipping papers nervously, and so on. Right? And then we have the climax. This is, again, the lottery's already underway. The names are being called. And we finally find out that towards the end that the Hutchinson family is selected. And, of course, this is the climax because there's no turning back. Now that all the slips of paper are given away, there's no exchanging of papers. No one can move them around. Everyone's unsure of their fate. But essentially their fate is set. There is no way of moving. And that's a good way to think about climax, too, is that it's the point of no return. It's the point of no return where actions have already been decided and there's nothing to be done about it. So everything after that is presumably falling action. We know that since the Hutchinsons have been selected, only Mrs. Hutchinson, Tessie, remains, and she is the one that's selected from the family. And of course, she resists. But of course, we know that that's futile. There's nothing she can do about it because it's already been decided. Even her own husband, Bill, and her own son, Davy, are chosen and given rocks to so that they can begin the stoning process. And of course, that is the denouement too, is that she's killed by the villagers. And there's nothing, and it's a very short denouement, but that's the case, right? Presumably after the story ends, we assume everyone goes back to the same routine, waiting till next year for the lottery to take place and for someone else to be killed and stoned. And so that's a very traditional plot. There's very little that's different or experimental in terms of the story. But what's kind of interesting, what I really had fun with the first time I read the story, were the characters. The characters are so interesting to me because there's really only, in my opinion, 4 characters that really matter in the story. And that's Mr. Summers, the Hutchinsons, and Old Man Warner. And because they each represent something and they're doing something very different. So if we I want to look at Mr. Summers first. He's essentially the central authority in the village. He's respected and he's obeyed, and he's the one that's clearly calm. Um, but he, as we'll see later, and we'll talk about juxtaposition later, he is pivotal. He's the pivotal antagonist for everything that we would consider wrong or immoral or uh, backwards about this village. And we know that he's one of the main characters because, of course, he conducts the lottery. He's the one who calls out names, and he's very, calm and civil about this process, a process that we all would, probably conclude is inhumane. And then we have the Hutchinsons, and they are a very, basic type of family. It's a ma and pa and a boy and a little girl, right? It's a very basic, what we consider a nuclear family, a traditional looking family. But each member, and I'm really just going to focus on Bill and Tessie, each one plays a very different role, right? Bill, the husband, doesn't resist the lottery's outcome. He accepts it. He doesn't want to fight. In fact, he's embarrassed when Tessie blurts out that it's unfair when their family is chosen, when it's been narrowed down to their family, before the family members pick up their own individual papers. She blurts out that it was unfair that they were chosen, that something was wrong. And she even tries throwing her in-laws, her extended family, into the mix, saying that they should draw again. And of course, everyone chimes in. Even her own husband chimes in. No, that's only fair. That's how it works. That wouldn't be fair if they had to draw twice. So despite his own life, and despite the lives of his wife and his kids, at the fate of stones, he still does not resist, and he essentially represents submissiveness. Right? We would all consider that the lottery is some sort of oppressive system. It represents oppression. Yet he is not vocal against it. He does not speak out against it. Tessie, on the other hand, is an interesting character. I think generally we would all consider ourselves to be like Tessie. I know some students on the discussion board claimed, well, I would have run away. If I was Tessie, I would have just gone out there. Well, there's not much of a choice because she's also under this system too, right? She's been exposed presumably all her life to the lottery, and that's all she knows. So she doesn't think about running away. Instead, she thinks, no, someone else needs to be picked, just not me and not my family. So she resists the outcome. And it's quite telling, too, that, it's the woman that resists. And of course, I know some of you made that connection, that this is clearly traditional, and by traditional, it's inherently sexist, and we'll talk about that, too. And she claims it isn't fair, and she demands that the lottery be redone, and so she represents struggle under oppression. She's the exact opposite of Bill. Again, only in the sense that she's resisting instead of being submissive. They're both under this oppressive regime, but they are obviously representing two different kinds of people. And then finally we get to Old Man Warner. And he's an interesting character because he doesn't have much to say, but he clearly represents the older generation, the generation that's clearly started and continued this lottery. And he's, of course, the oldest man in the village, and so the black box that they used for the selection has been around even before he was. So he's given some really small bits of dialogue, but they're clearly important because he essentially damns other villagers. He is insulted by their laziness, by their abandonment of traditions, and presumably he represents conservatism. He represents the old money or the old age, and this perpetuating idea of what tradition is. And so these four characters each represent different parts, right? Mr. Summers represents the young-ish, but certainly not the oldest central authority. We have Old Man Warner, who represents the oldest one, and who even is upset and Mr. Summers jokes that he makes while he's at the center of the town, right where the stool and the box sits. And then we have the Hutchinsons, who are this family working within a system and unable to escape their fate. Okay, so we've talked about plot, we've talked about characters. Let's talk about point of view. Now, before I can talk too much about point of view, let me give you some basic definitions. So, point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. Right? Every story has a narrator, but the narrator isn't always a character in a story. Right? For instance, in the lottery, no character is telling the story. Mr. Graves, the Hutchinsons, Summers, Old Man Warner, none of them are telling the story. This is told from some neutral, objective stance, someone who's outside of the village looking down at the village, right? But some stories are told from the first person's point of view. Either a character in the story is narrating over the events. And sometimes we even have second person stories, and those are a little more rare, where we say, you do this, and it kind of tells you what to do. And we see some memes that look a lot like that are told from second person point of view. But then we have these third person. That's probably the one we've seen the most of. Third person is told from a non-character point of view. Like, none of the characters are telling the story. It's some third party. But there are two kinds of third person point of view. One is this one, third person omniscient. The other is called third person limited. Limited. So let me talk about this one first, limited one. Third person limited would mean that it would be, it would still be talking about he said this, she said this, and they did this, and so on. It would still be in third person point of view, but it would really be told from one of the main character's perspective. For instance, if it was third person limited, it might follow Tessie. Shirley Jackson may have followed just Tessie Hutchinson's actions throughout the story. We would have heard about her being at home washing the dishes, and suddenly she remembers, oh my goodness, it's time for the lottery. But perhaps we would have heard a different story, right? We may have heard that earlier she was already upset and she was trying to hide from the lottery, and then something finally speaks to her that, no, my children are there, I can't just hide from the lottery, I need to go. And she finally goes and makes up an excuse, right? We could hear about all these kinds of interesting sides of the story, but Shirley Jackson didn't choose the limited perspective. She chose the omniscient third person perspective. And that is essentially, as I point out here, it's like a godlike perspective, as if you're looking down on this village from the sky, able to discuss every person's thoughts and feelings and actions, regardless of where they are. So you're not limited to one character, you're able to talk about all these characters equally. And that's, I think, is so important, because she's able to look down at the entire village. She's able to discuss the entire community, the entire society, and therefore make a commentary about the society. And so that's also, again, this story would have been very different if it was limited to one of the characters, either in first person or in third person limited. And of course, it would have been a very different story if it was in second person. And then we get to the setting. And I usually divide the setting into three sections. There's time, there's place, and there's circumstance, right? The time, we know it's sometime in summer. We don't know what year it is. And I know some students on discussion board were very quick to say, oh, this was written in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Therefore, I believe this was published 1940s? Let's see. 1948. It was published in 1948. So a lot of people were quick to make the claim, oh, this must have been written in the 1940s, therefore it is about the 1940s. Well, that's not necessarily true. In fact, I would make the argument that based on the technology that's available to them, the references to a village, even though no such villages really exist at that time anymore, this is again post World War II, these villages don't exist. And so it's difficult, really, to make the claim that this is happening in any specific year. We just know the place, really, which is a village We know it's somewhat rural and agricultural because they mention washing dishes. They mention these really traditional um, family uh, compositions. They mention stones and pieces of paper and this wood chipped box and so on. Again, what we think would probably be a pre-modern age or perhaps a grassroots age. And then finally we have circumstance. We know that the setting includes this idea of some lottery being held in the town square. Okay. Now we have style, and this is where juxtaposition is so important. Style really refers to how a story is told, in the kind of tone or mood that the story is narrated in. And of course, I can talk about mood and I can talk about tone, but I think the obvious device that Shirley Jackson sticks to is juxtaposition. Now, some of you seem to have some confusion about what a juxtaposition is, so let me just clarify that for you. A juxtaposition is any word or phrase that contains two elements that are being set side by side for the purpose of comparing or contrasting them. So if I said something like, a warm light on a winter's day, we have the contrast between warmth and winter, which is normally cold. So we have hot and cold being put side by side, and those create interesting effects, right? So we're not just concerned that these two things are set side by side for comparison. We're also interested in the fact that this comparison reveals something about the story. So some of you included examples from the text that arguably, yes, are juxtapositions, but did not contribute to the story, or at least you did not explain what was or how that was contributing to the story's theme or message. Others, I know I saw some people add examples from the story, but those aren't technically juxtapositions. For instance, some people mentioned the title being a juxtaposition. Well, no, it was not, because it wasn't being juxtaposed with anything. There was nothing next to it or by it that would be compared to it. And lastly, I know some people mentioned the setting itself is a juxtaposition. That it's supposed to be a summer day, and again, that's hard to argue because you have to spend the entire length of the story figuring out that juxtaposition. But by definition, a juxtaposition is something that happens within a word or phrase or maybe even a sentence, not much longer than that. So we're looking at sentences that had elements in them that were contrasting and had something to do with the story here. So I've included a few examples. Again, this is by no means an entire list, but this does give us some clue into what would be considered juxtaposition. So one sentence here I have quoted. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. Now, if you're not aware of it yet, here is the juxtaposition. We have all of these elements: the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program. These are typically fun, youthful, and exciting events, completely harmless, and usually just for the benefit of entertainment. And these are being juxtaposed, being put right next to the lottery. So presumably, the lottery, square dances, teenage club, the Halloween program, all of these elements must then therefore share something, right? They even claim, these were conducted by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities, as if all of these events are civic, meaning they involve people, they're fun, they're these normal town-sized events. Now, this is what juxtaposition looks like, because after rereading the story, you would know, that, of course, the lottery is this horrible, horrible practice. But to Mr. Summers, and presumably to the rest of the village, there was no problem here, right? The lottery was no different than how you would hold square dancing, or how you would hold a club meeting, or how you would hold a Halloween festival. No difference. Take a look also at this next sentence. They, meaning the men, stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. So here again, we have another juxtaposition. We have one element, the men, and we have another element, the pile of stones. And of course, both of them being gathered, right? The men are standing together. There's a pile of stones, all these individual stones coming together. And of course, they represent two very different things, right? One's alive, one's not. But then again, we also have one as an instrument of death and killing. The other one is the executor, the one actually committing the crime. We also have this idea of what about joking being quiet, even though normally when we think of joking, it's supposed to be loud and exuberant. And here they smiled instead of laughing. Again, these elements are being put side by side purposely because it contributes to the larger message that there is some anxiety about what's to come, that something is wrong with this picture of stones in the corner. And finally, I have this one last example. This is Old Man Warner talking to the Adams, both Adams, the wife and husband, and he tells them, "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." And of course, here are the two elements, right? One is that it's bad to see someone joking. That there's something wrong with joking. There's something wrong with being happy or creating and retaining that happiness. And so we have this person who really represents tradition getting upset at any little change, even in a change of the benefit of humor. Again, this is an interesting juxtaposition because it then, of course, is a criticism on this traditionalism and how extreme the traditionalism is. Another device that's really predominant here is symbolism. Symbolism is, of course, so important because we use symbols to represent ideas, whether they're concrete or abstract, that are difficult to discuss in the text and are therefore embodied by one simple object or one simple word that can convey that entire idea quickly. Right? So there are several symbols of tradition, and so there's two kinds of symbols that I notice. There's a lot of symbols of tradition, and there are a lot of symbols of good and evil. So let's focus on tradition. Besides Old Man Warner being a character who represents tradition, I want to focus on things, even abstract things like patriarchy. For those of you who don't know, patriarchy is a system of government that privileges and favors men over women. It puts men in leadership roles. The opposite would be a matriarchy, where women are put in power. But this is a patriarchy. We clearly know this because Mr. Summers, a man, is the one in charge of the lottery. All the men are the ones who draw for their families. The women, of course, stay at home cooking and cleaning, presumably, since that's what Tessie joked about when she got to the crowd. And even the men are the ones gathering together to discuss, normal things like taxes and farming and so on, while the women look after children. So they're given subservient gender roles. And we know that this is a very traditional idea because, of course, these gender roles, even though to some extent they still exist in this country, are largely dissipating. So again, we have two abstract concepts that evoke this idea of tradition. We also have this idea of routine, something done over and over and over again. We know that the lottery has been done many years since before Old Man Warner. We know that the same black box is used, wood chips and all. We know that everyone is used to gathering on a specific date in the same place, and so on. And then, of course, we have these references to old things and old people, customs, and so on. So again, all of these items, all these elements contribute to this idea of tradition. And of course, we also have good and evil symbols, right? When we think of good and evil, we might associate colors with them, right? Black box and white slips of paper. We imagine little boys or children being symbols of goodness or innocence, yet they're throwing stones that are meant to be murderous, and so they represent evil. We also have, again, this is more clash of color with black dots on a white slip of paper, black and white, good and evil, and so on. And again, these are obvious symbols, but yet these are important symbols that we witness throughout the story and that contribute, again, to the story. There may have been other symbols, other items that are mentioned, either somehow the way someone's dressed, or this, maybe some nuanced dialogue that someone gives. But it's probably not as important as these elements here that are contributing to this shared idea of tradition and good and evil. And so finally, based on all these elements, based on plot, based on characters, based on the point of view, based on the setting, based on the style, and based on the symbolism that we have, we should be able to arrive at a theme. And that's what's so important, and that's what I was hoping that many of you would consider as you are writing your discussion board posts. And not just your discussion board posts, but as you prepare to write your literary analyses. So for this one, usually the theme should be in a complete sentence, but I've just got a small note here that the story is about the abject consequences of a lottery designed long ago and perpetuated by tradition. This idea that regardless of our morality or our reasoning or our fear, we are quick to adopt and continue traditions that were always put forth. And I've included a few quotes here that I thought were fairly representative of this idea. Chinua Achebe, who wrote a famous story called Things Fall Apart, she says, when a tradition gathers enough strength to go on for centuries, you don't just turn it off one day. And how true is that, right? We have several people for years, maybe even centuries, who have continued to do the same routine over and over again. And of course, the moment that someone's upsetting that tradition, Old Man Warner, of course, gets upset even with the joking, and Tessie immediately gets upset that this entire process isn't fair. It doesn't stop the lottery. In fact, she's put to death very quickly, and now the only voice that seemed to damn the entire process is silenced forever. Woody Allen had this to say. He said, tradition is the illusion of permanence. We think that things don't change, and so we of course, we mentioned the tradition's ideas of not wanting to change. But that's the thing, right? Tradition is actually not to change at all. I misspoke. That tradition isn't actually staying the same. Tradition is constantly changing, where you're forced to change as time moves. We are slaves to these changes, regardless if we want them or not. Ultimately, and this is an interesting point that one of my colleagues brought up when we discussed this story, is that eventually the entire village may die out. And so few, that's why the village was so small at one point. It said they used to take days to do it. Now only it takes a few hours to conduct the lottery. And it might be because it was just faster to do it that way. They found a faster way of doing it. But I suspect it's because they've ran out of names to select, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller until someone, the last person, dies because of it. So, what we've just done with the lottery is an analysis. An analysis, by definition, is taking something whole and breaking it into its parts and examining those parts to understand the whole. And so you'll notice that we took apart the story by looking at its plot, its characters, its point of view, and so on. And then even in the plot, breaking it down into its parts, the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the denouement. Rather than just characters in general, we've broken it down to 4 important ones, and so on and so forth. And that is what I'm expecting from you all as you begin to analyze the stories for your literary analysis. That you should be aware, and I encourage you to take notes like this, break it down into its parts. Think about the plot. There was a useful in Blackboard. I think it's in week 2. Yes, yes. There was several items that I links to resources that I put up in week 2. You'll notice the elements of a story is one such item. It tells you, and I think there's even a cheat sheet guide that I have open. Let's see. There we go. Yeah. Even if you just break down the story into these parts, that should give you an idea of an analysis. To think about the setting, think about the characters, think about the conflict, think about the plot, and then finally, based on those 4 parts, you should arrive at a theme. It's some central idea that or message that's being revealed by the story. Okay. So again, just a reminder for everyone, this is going to be important as we go through the next few stories. And so for week 3, you'll notice that it's already available. It's Happy Endings, 2 stories, Happy Endings and Bullet in the Brain. And I think I already have one. I'm sorry, looks like my internet connection briefly, there he is. We already have one lecture about structure in short stories, and that's the one I was referring to earlier about the Freytag pyramid. And so that should give you some clues about these 2 stories, about Happy Endings and Bullet in the Brain. So keep these things in mind. Not all stories will be as traditional as the lottery, but each one should still have similar elements that they rely on in order to get those messages across. Okay, I'm going to leave this lecture off on one last note, and that's again about discussion board. So the week 3 discussion assignment is already available. You can see some of the questions that are here. I encourage you all to carefully look at these questions to get a handle on what you need to think about as you read the stories, and give some thought also to your literary analysis. You should expect in the week 4 folder the literary analysis instructions. We're going to cover in week 4. We're going to cover our last story. I'm going to give you the instructions to the literary analysis. I'll have everyone complete a draft of it and submit to me part of that draft. I may, depending on the size of the assignment, because I know we're talking about close to 80 students, and it might be difficult for me to give feedback to every single one of you, but I may just invite everyone to submit their work to me if they'd like to. I might not make it a requirement. It just depends on how much time I have available to cover these. And that way, after week 4, the final draft will be due online. But again, I'll explain all this in a later lecture once we get closer to week 4 and once I've already posted that assignment. As always, if you have questions for me at any point, feel free to email me. I know some of you already have about questions with your grade, or about questions for the assignment, or what you can do better. All right, thank you.